I'm going to get the... Oh, oops. I need to change this title. I got the title wrong. The book Jumper. Oh! Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I got her name wrong as well. There we go. Prologue. Will ran. He ran and ran. The island seemed bigger than usual, and he'd been running for so long his chest hurt. Across the moor, through the fields, down the beach, past the graveyard and Lennox's house, into the village, up to the stone circle, through the library, back to his cottage, in and out of the last wisps of fog that hung over McAllister Castle. Nothing. The dog ran beside him. Its black ears strained in the wind, and its huge paws left prints on the moor. Why weren't there any other footprints? Why couldn't they find him? He could never have left the dog behind, so he must be here somewhere. What had he said just before he'd stepped outside? He'd only been going out for a walk, hadn't he? They ran on, up the narrow path to the cliff top, the dog ahead, Will behind. But there was nobody up there either. Of course not in this weather. A storm had blown up and it had started to rain. They came to a stop at the end of the earth. Though of course it wasn't really the end of the earth, just the end of the island. The world carried on beyond this precipice. The water below stretched away to the horizon, and beyond that the other islands. Was that where he was, somewhere out there, beyond the horizon? For a while the two of them gazed out to the sea. With one hand, Will scratched the dog behind the ears, and with the other he shielded his eyes the better to see through the rain. To no avail. Sherlock Holmes had vanished without a trace. The monster had slept for many, many years, deep, deep in the darkest corner of its cave. On and on it had slept as time rolled over its waves, and it had dreamed of its awakening. It had slept for so long that the people of the kingdom no longer knew it existed. At first, perhaps, they had dimly remembered the terrible creature, but over the years it had faded to a dark foreboding. Now, however, as the fog was forgetting engulfed the people entirely, now the time had come for the monster to open its eyes once more. Once upon a time there was an island. I have to correct something. There I go. There we go. Once upon a time, there we stood, Alexis and me, chucking things into suitcases, socks, sweaters, pants. I tugged handfuls of clothes from my wardrobe and flung them into the wheeled suitcase that lay open behind me as Alexis did the same thing in the next room. We barely even registered what we were packing, whether we'd included our favorite clothes or not. The main thing was to get it done quickly. That's what we'd agreed. Because if we'd taken our time over the packing and made a list the way we usually did, we would surely have realized what we were doing was completely and utterly crazy. Everyone in my family was crazy. That's what my mom, Alexis, always said anyway when I asked her why she'd run away from her home in Scotland at the age of 17, with nothing but a suitcase in her hand and me in her belly. She'd upped sticks and left for Germany, pregnant and not even legally an adult yet, and she'd ended up in Bochum. I think she felt too young to be a mom, so she wanted me to call her by her first name instead, which I always had and still did. But now I was nearly 17 myself, well, in 14 months I would be, and it was starting to look like I'd inherited the crazy gene. That morning at breakfast, an hour ago now, I too had spontaneously decided to leave the country. We'd gone online and booked ourselves flights on a budget airline departing that same afternoon. All we had to do now was pack. I rooted around in a drawer and hurriedly dug out a few bras and pairs of underwear. Bring your warm jacket with you, Amy, said Alexis as she wheeled her suitcase, stuffed to bursting with clothes, into my bedroom and tried to squish my pillow on top. Inside the case I could see her organic cotton corduroys and a shirt from Etsy decorated with a brightly colored apple print. I don't really think I need a parka in July, I muttered. My suitcase was pretty full by now, too, although mainly with books. Clothes-wise, I'd packed only what was strictly necessary. The way I saw it, it was better to take one less cardigan than to have to do with one of my favorite books. I think you're underestimating the weather over there, said Alexis, eyeing the contents of my suitcase and shaking her mahogany brown locks. Her eyes were red and swollen. She'd been up all night crying. Just take your e-reader, won't that do? But I don't have Momo or Pride and Prejudice as e-books. You've read both those books about 100 times each. And what if I want to read them for the 101st time while I'm there? They've got more than enough books on that blessed island, Amy. Believe me, you have no idea. I ran my fingertips over the cover of my well-thumbed copy of Momo. I'd often wished I'd had an enchanted tortoise like the one in Momo to guide me on my journey through life. I needed this book. It comforted me when I was sad. I needed it now more than ever. Alexis sighed. Well, make sure you fit the jacket in somehow, okay? It can get pretty chilly there. She sat down in the suitcase and tugged at the zipper. I'm worried this whole thing is a bad idea anyway, she fretted. Are you sure that's the only place you'll be able to take your mind off things? I nodded. The tiny boat pitched in the swell, tossed back and forth as through the sea were playing ball with it. Lightning flickered across the sky where dark storm clouds were massing, shrouding the ocean in a cloak of surreal gray, pierced by sudden flares of light and ominous rolls of thunder. The water had turned the color of slate, and the rain was coming down in sheets. Heavy, biting gray raindrops had hammered down on the waves and sharpened their crests. What with the thunderstorm and giant waves smashing against the cliffs that loomed on the horizon, Mother Nature was putting on a pretty formidable display. It was terrifying, awe-inspiring, and wonderful all at the same time. On second thought, wonderful was probably a bit of an overstatement. The problem was that I happened to be sitting in this tiny little boat, in the middle of this thunderstorm, clinging onto my seat for dear life to keep myself from falling overboard. Spray shot into the air and into our faces. Alexis tried gamely to hold on to our luggage, while the man driving the boat cranked up the engine till it roared. The rain had come down quite suddenly. Within seconds I'd been soaked through. It was also freezing cold, and all I could think about was arriving. I didn't care where, as long as it was somehow warm and dry. During our flight from Dortmund to Edinburgh, the sun had still been shining in a bright, cloudless sky. And though a few clouds had appeared by the time we'd boarded the little plane to Sumburgh Airport on mainland, the biggest of the Shetland Islands off the Scottish coast, I certainly hadn't reckoned with this apocalyptic scene. I blinked at the burning of the salt water on my eyes as another wave rocked our boat and nearly swallowed up Alexis's handmade felt handbag. But it was getting harder and harder to hold on to my seat. The ice-cold wind had long since numbed my fingers to the point where I could barely control them. Reading about a storm like this in a book was far more pleasurable experience when I was reading, or even when I was scared, when I shuddered in horror, when the story plunged me right into the midst of the most terrible disasters. I never entirely lost that warm, cozy, tucked up on the sofa feeling. There was no trace of that feeling now, and I realized that real-life storms, unlike literary ones, were most definitely not my idea of fun. The next wave was even more savage than the last, and it washed clean over my head. At the same moment I gulped frantically for breath, not the best idea, as it caused me to choke on a huge mouthful of water. Coughing and gasping, I tried to empty my lungs of seawater while Alexis landed a few hearty thumps on my sodden back. This sent her bag sailing overboard. Oh crap, but Alexis seemed to have given up on the idea of bringing all our possessions safely ashore anyway, and didn't even spare a glance for this portion of our worldly goods. "Nearly there, Amy, nearly there," she called. No sooner had the words crossed her lips than they were carried away on the wind. "We did want to come here, remember. I'm sure we're going to have a lovely holiday on Stormsay." It was probably supposed to sound cheerful, but her voice cracked with suppressed panic. "We're here because we're running away," I replied, although too quietly for Alexis to hear. I didn't want to remind her or myself of the real reasons for our trip. After all, we were running away to forget. To forget that Dominic had broken up with Alexis and gone back to his wife and children, completely out of the blue, and to forget that those stupid idiots in my year at school. No, I'd promised myself not to even think about it anymore. The boat's outboard motor howled as if trying to drown out the storm. The rain grew heavier, beating down on my head and shoulders and lashing at my face. It was literally impossible for me to get any wetter. But I was relieved nevertheless to see that this island seemed to be drawing nearer, Stormsay, the home of my ancestors. Through a curtain of wet hair, I squinted at the shoreline and hoped the skipper knew what he was doing, and that we were not about to get smashed to smithereens on the rocks. The cliff face looked immense, jagged, and deadly. It towered nearly 100 feet above the slate-gray waves, and at the summit, way up high where the raging of the wind was at its most treacherous, there was somebody standing at the cliff's edge. At first I thought it was a tree, but then I realized it was a human being, leaning into the storm and looking out to sea, a figure with short hair, coat flapping in the wind, watching us from the cliff top. It had one hand raised to shield its eyes, and the other rested on the head of a huge black dog. I stared back, shivering, as the boat hove to. We left the cliffs behind us and battled on, arcing toward the eastern shore of the island. The figure receded into the distance, eventually disappearing from view. And then finally we came to a jetty. He was half submerged and wobbled precariously, but to our captain managed to moor the boat with a few deft movements, and we tumbled out onto dry land at last. The embankment was slippery and the rain was still falling hard, but we'd reached our destination, Stormsay. The word tasted of secrets. It sounded somehow full of promise and slightly eerie at the same time. This was the first time I'd ever been to the island. For a long time, Alexis had never even mentioned it to me, until at some point during primary school I'd realized that not all children learned both German and English from their parents, and that my name sounded different from everyone else's, Amy Lennox. And even then, Alexis had been reluctant to admit that we came from Scotland. When she'd left, in fact, aged 17, she'd vowed never to go back, and now we trudged along a muddy street, the wheels of our suitcases sinking into the sludge. On either side of us, scattered at intervals along the road, were little houses, no more than a handful of cottages, really, with crooked roofs and cob walls and windows of bulging glass, some of which flickered with yellow light. I wondered which one my grandmother lived in, and hoped that the little houses were more weatherproof on the inside than they looked from the outside. The man who'd ferried us across to the island mumbled something about the pub and beard, and disappeared through a doorway. Alexis, however, plowed straight on past the last of the cottages. She seemed determined to leave even these meager remnants of civilization behind us, and it was all I could do just to keep up with her. My suitcase had gotten stuck in yet another muddy puddle, and I had to tug at the handle with all my strength to get it out. "Your mom does live in an actual house, right?" I grumbled, wondering why I hadn't questioned Alexis more closely as to what exactly it was that was so crazy about my grandmother. After all, crazy might mean that she ate tree bark and wore clothes made of pine cones and lived out in the wild with the creatures of the forest. Alexis didn't answer, but simply gestured towards something in the darkness ahead of us and beckoned me to follow her. At that moment, my suitcase suddenly became unstuck with unexpected force. I was splattered from head to toe with mud. Brilliant! While Alexis still looked gorgeous, even with her wet hair, as if she'd stepped straight out of a shampoo ad, I was starting to feel more and more like a drowned rat. I muttered away to myself crossly as I trudged on. The road soon narrowed into a track and grew even muddier. The lights were far behind us now. We could barely see the little village at all anymore, although the icy wind still blew alongside us like a faithful friend and wormed its way through all the little gaps in the knit of my woolly sweater. Raindrops whipped into my face as I caught up with Alexis. We were really heading out into the wilderness. There was somebody on the cliff top. Did you see? I said breathlessly, trying to distract myself from the feeling that any minute now I was going to freeze to death. On Shakespeare's seat in this weather? I'd be very surprised, murmured Alexis so quietly I could barely hear her. Then from the top of a steep little slope she just clambered up, she offered, "Here, let me take your suitcase." I heaved the case into her arms and scrambled up after it. When I reached the top, I realized we were standing on a sort of plateau. In the distance, I could see another cluster of lights and towers that looked like the turrets of a castle etched against the night sky. And there were lights close by, too, in some of the windows of a huge mansion to our right. We were standing at a fork in the path. Straight ahead, the track carried on across the moor. But Alexis took the right-hand fork and marched up to a wrought-iron gate between two hedges, behind which I glimpsed something like a park or a gravel drive with a fountain in the middle. Those big houses in the movies at least almost always had gravel paths flanked by crisply clipped shrubs, statues, climbing roses, and often a classic convertible for good measure. You had to have imposing backdrop for the lover's kiss or the tracking down of the murderer. The house behind the gate looked pretty grand, and at any rate, even from this distance, the walls were studded with countless bay windows, and a whole host of little towers and chimneys jutted into the sky, grazing the storm clouds. Behind the window panes hung heavy curtains with flickering candlelight shining through the gaps between them. The rain grew heavier now, and the individual raindrops merged to form a veil, as if trying at the last moment to hide the mansion from view. But it was far too late for that. We'd landed on the island, and there was no going back now. Alexis laid her fingertips on the ornate handle of the gate and took a deep breath. "All happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," she murmured at last, pushing open the gate. "What?" I said. "Oh, it's just the first line of a novel I often used to read here," she sighed. "I see," I said, though I didn't really. My teeth were chattering so loudly by this time that I could hardly think straight. We hefted and hauled our luggage across a small park made up of gravel paths and crisply clipped shrubs, past a fountain and several climbing roses, and up a flight of marble steps. The only thing missing was the classic convertible. Without further ado, Alexis rang the doorbell. A gong sounded loudly inside the house, but it was still a long time before the oak door swung open and a large wrinkly nose emerged from behind it. The nose belonged to an old man in a suit, who eyed us keenly over the top of his glasses. "Good evening, Mr. Stevens. It's me, Alexis." Mr. Stevens gave a curt nod. "Of course, ma'am, I can see that," he said, stepping aside. "We were expecting you?" "No, but I'd like to speak to my mother," said Alexis. Mr. Stevens nodded again and helped her heave her battered suitcase over the threshold. When he reached for my case with liver-spotted hands, I quickly sidestepped him. I'd lugged the thing this far. I could carry it the last few feet without dumping it on an old man who must surely be even more of a weakling than I was. But Mr. Stevens gave me such a stern and un-old manish look that in the end I let him take the suitcase and stuffed my hands in my jacket pockets instead. And indeed the weight of our luggage seemed to give him no trouble at all. "Wow," I gasped the moment we stepped in and out of the rain. The entrance hall to the mansion was bigger than our entire flat. When you stepped into our hallway at home, you found yourself in a dark, narrow tunnel with ancient daisy-patterned wallpaper peeling off the walls. Alexis had tried to spruce it up with a bit of beaded curtain and an indoor palm tree, but the tower block apartment remained stubbornly unglamorous. The living room, which also served as Alexis's bedroom, the kitchen with its 70 tiles, the bathroom, and my bedroom, where the carpet had bunched up with age, they all felt like boxes, concrete boxes with tiny windows, in which even bookshelves and colorful polka-dot teapots couldn't counteract the gray. My grandmother's hallway, on the other hand, was incredible. The ceiling arched so high above our heads that looking up at the paintings on it almost made me dizzy. Instead of fat naked angels on clouds or other such popular motifs, the artists had painted pictures of people with books. Some of them were reading, some of them were pointing toward bulging bookcases, and others had placed open books across their faces. Interspersed with the pictures of people, the same coat of arms appeared again and again, a green stag with huge antlers perched proudly atop a pile of books against a wine-red background. A chandelier hung at the center of the entrance hall, its arms made up of strings of golden letters. Matching lamps were mounted at regular intervals along the wood-paneled walls, and between them were more stags of coats of arms. The floor was spread with brightly colored oriental rugs, the letters woven into them that I had never seen before, and on the opposite wall a staircase swept upward, its oak banister fashioned from carved books. It was just possible I'd inherited my love of reading from my grandmother, I reflected. "Follow me, if you please. I shall attend to your luggage shortly," said Mr. Stevens. For a man of his age, his back was remarkably straight, and his polished shoes made not the slightest sound in the opulent rugs. We, on the other hand, left a squelching trail of muddy footsteps in our wake. I whispered to Alexis, do you think maybe we should take off our... But she shook her head distractedly, only now that I noticed that her fists were clenched around the fabric of her woolen coat. She was chewing at her bottom lip, and her eyes flicked nervously back and forth. Oh well, we had to get a move on anyway, to keep up with the butler, but I still felt bad about making such a mess in the most beautiful hallway I've ever set foot in. I tried to pick my way around the edges of the rugs. At least the glossy wooden floorboards underneath would be easier to clean. They were certainly a lot more slippery. I'd only gone a few steps when I lost my balance on the sheet of mud and rainwater beneath the soles of my sneakers, and my feet slid out from under me. For a split second I teetered in the air, one flailing arm grazing Mr. Stevens' pomaded coiffure and ruffling its cement-like surface before landing heavily on my bum. Oh, crap. But the butler turned out to inspect me through his now wonky glasses, eyebrows raised, and said nothing. The hair on the back of his head stood up like spikes, like the feathers of a cockatoo. Sorry, I mumbled. Alexis, without a word, put out a hand to help me up. She was used to my frequent accidents and liked to console me at times like this, by calling me her little giraffe, because it sometimes seemed as though my arms and legs were simply too long for me to control. And I did often feel like a giraffe compared to all the other girls my age who'd gotten curvier over the past few years instead of taller and thinner like I had. A giraffe with roller skates strapped to its clumsy feet. I let Alexis pull me to my feet, refrained from rubbing my bruised bum, trying to reserve the last shred of my dignity. Mr. Stevens, whose hair, incredibly, had already regained its former bomb-proof glory, carried on walking. We'd crossed the entrance hall now, and led us through a door set into the wood paneling onto a long corridor, up some stairs, along another corridor, and I was just starting to think that if I ever got lost in this house, I would never be able to find my way out again when we finally arrived at a sitting room containing a silk-upholstered divan. Please, he motioned for us to sit down as he busied himself lighting a fire at a large grate. But we didn't sit down because the fire, which was soon crackling merrily, was far more inviting. Alexis and I stationed ourselves as close as possible to the hot flames while the butler disappeared from the room. The heat almost sizzled as it met my skin. It sank slowly into my hands and my face in what felt like a series of tiny little electric shots. I closed my eyes and relished the reddish-orange glow that shone through my eyelids, but there the heat of the fire wet my clothes. It bounced off it as if a suit of armor. Only in one or two places did it manage to work its way slowly through the fabric. I didn't know how long I stood there, willing the heat to filter right through my bones. Perhaps it was only a few moments. Mr. Stevens returned much too soon at any rate. Mayor Head Lennox, Lady of Stormsay, he announced. I forced myself to open my eyes and turn away from the fire. Like all the women in my family, it seemed my grandmother was tall. She was even taller than Alexis and me, or did she just look taller because her white hair was drawn up into an imposing knot on the top of her head? She had the same dark eyes as me and Alexis, anyhow, shining in a nest of fine wrinkles. Her nose was a little too big, her lips a little too thin, but she must have been very beautiful once upon a time, and her dark green silk dress, fastened at the neck by a white collar and a brooch, seemed like her house to belong to a different era. On a ribbon around her neck hung a slim pair of reading glasses, the frame set with tiny red stones. For a while she and Alexis looked at each other in silence, Alexis standing there in her very wet, very colorful clothes, kneading the fabric of her coat so hard she wrung little droplets out of it. I'd always thought of Alexis as a sort of vegan reincarnation of Pippi Longstocking, strong, brave, different from everybody else, a friend who I called by her first name. A mother who didn't give a crap if people snorted contemptuously to see her walking along the top of a wall, singing loudly as she took her 5-year-old daughter to kindergarten. It wasn't like her to be nervous, but she was now. Alexis moistened her lips as my grandmother's gaze shifted to me. She looked searchingly at me, and an unspoken question hung in the air between us, although I had no idea what it was. Alexis, too, remained silent. I swallowed, and Lady Maired raised her eyebrows expectantly. The fire behind us crackled. And outside the rain drummed against the window panes. The climbing roses and the manicured shrubs rustled, bracing themselves against the storm that was howling around the house. My grandmother's nostrils flared as she breathed in. The water from our hair and clothes trickled off us and formed puddles at our feet. Still, Alexis didn't say a word. This was unbearable. So I'm Amy, I ventured finally. Nice to to make your acquaintance, I stammered. And then, as no response was forthcoming, I added, my lady, for good measure. Everyone knows aristocrats can sometimes have a bit of a thing about their titles. At the same time, entirely of their own accord, my legs twisted themselves into a kind of mangled curtsy. It wasn't exactly the pinnacle of elegance. I felt the blood rush to my face. The ghost of a smile played around the corners of my grandmother's mouth. "Is this yours?" she asked Alexis. "Can it really be true?" She took a step toward me and ran her fingertips down my cheek and along the line of my chin. Beside me, Alexis nodded. "I got pregnant very young." "Indeed," said Lady Merritt, and now she smiled in earnest. "Well, then, Amy, I suppose I must be your grandmother," she declared, adding in a language I assumed was Gaelic, "Cud me fate. Luckily, she switched straight back to English. "A thousand welcomes to Lennox House. Don't get your hopes up," Alexis interrupted her. "This is not why we came back." "No? Why then?" Alexis took a deep breath, as if speaking to her mother was a great effort. "We needed to get away for a bit, and we didn't know where to go," she began. "Perhaps we were being a bit hasty, but anyway, we just want to stay here for a while and recover, that's all. It's Amy's summer holidays. We have to go back in a few weeks." Alexis knew perfectly well, of course, that I hated my school now. I never wanted to see my so-called friends again. But when we decided to flee abroad, we hadn't talked about how long we should stay, and I supposed we might have to go back to Germany at some point. After all, I was still planning to do my A-levels there and study medicine afterward. But I didn't want to think about that right now, and my grandmother too batted away Alexis's objections with a sweep of her slender hand. "If you want to stay, you know what my condition is." She asked to read. "As long as you are here, she will read, and when the holidays are over, she can decide for herself." "Read? What do you mean?" I asked. "Why do I have to read?" Alexis sighed. "It's a long story, Treasure. It's to do with our family. But it's not important. She doesn't know," said my grandmother flatly. "She doesn't know." Her lips tightened as if she'd just bitten into a lemon. "What don't I know?" Lady Merritt was about to explain, but at that moment Alexis finally overcame her uncharacteristic nervousness. "Not tonight, okay?" she told my grandmother. I'm just not up to it right now. Amy's soaked and frozen half to death, as am I. Things haven't been easy for us these past few weeks, and getting here in the storm definitely wasn't. We'll talk tomorrow." At first it looked as though my grandmother was about to object, but she seemed suddenly to realize that I was still shivering. "Very well," she said. "Mr. Stevens will make up your rooms and run you a bath." A little while later Alexis and I were lying in a bathtub the size of a swimming pool. When I stood up, the water reached all the way to my waist, and if I tucked my legs in tight enough, I could even swim 1.5 strokes from end to end, but it was as if we were far too tired to do anything remotely sporty. Instead, we just bobbed about in the hot water, thawing out our numbed toes. Fragrant drifts of bubbles floated between us. From the ceiling of the marble bathroom hung another chandelier made of golden letters. As we negotiated the mansion's intricate web of corridors, I'd asked Alexis why she and Lady Merritt had such an issue about whether I should read or not. It was a no-brainer, after all. I certainly wasn't going to not read for the whole of the holidays. For years now, working my way through the contents of the city library had been my favorite pursuit, but Alexis had only shrugged and said, "This entire family is crazy, Amy, you know that." Now we relaxed wearily into the heat of the water, which felt almost painful against my cold skin. Its warmth spread slowly through my body, right to my core. I let myself sink just below the surface, and without moving a muscle watched my long thin hair as it wafted and coiled through the water in slow motion. Its rusty sheen was only a pale echo of Alexis's wild mane, and when my hair was wet you could barely even tell it was red. Still, I did feel a little bit like a sea anemone on a tropical ocean floor. There must be a nice life. Nothing to do all day but sit around being caressed by the warm current. It had just occurred to me that on that second thought I was quite glad I wasn't a sea anemone, because I'd probably get bored pretty quickly down there on the seabed without any books, where the gentle lilting of the water grew choppier. Alexis was on the move. First she paddled all the way across the bathtub, then she took a deep breath and dived down under the water. She crouched on the bottom of the tub for nearly 2 minutes, and when she resurfaced, her eyes looked as if she was trying hard not to cry. She was probably cursing the day she twisted her ankle on the pasture of the organic farm where she worked, and had a splint put on by a good-looking doctor in the ER. Dominic had found his way into her heart and our family far too quickly. The two of them had been together less than a year, but he'd become part of the family straight away. He'd cooked steaks for himself and me in our otherwise vegan kitchen. He'd come ice skating with us, and I missed him. He was the only one I missed. "I'm sure you're going to have a lovely holiday on Storm's Day," I said, quoting Alexis, and I meant it, because anything was better than sitting around at home where everything reminded you of everything, where Alexis had her heart broken, and where I risked running into kids from school, a school where people were not very forgiving toward a girl with straight A's and a flat chest. Alexis blinked back her tears. "Yes," she said, "yes, you're right." She looked at me for a few moments. Suddenly she grinned and she scooped some of the bubbles toward her. "Hey, Amy, could you be any more perfect start to a holiday than a full-on bubble fight?" I smiled and started stocking up on soapy ammo. Later, as I lay in bed, cocooned in a warm quilt, I listened to the storm outside my window. Though the howling and raging of the wind, I was sure I heard another sound like a child sobbing, was somehow crying out there on the moor. No, it must be my imagination. The princess lived in a castle with silver battlements and stained glass windows. It stood on a hill which the whole of the kingdom could be seen. Every day she climbed to the top of the highest tower and looked out across the land. She knew her kingdom, knew it well, but only from afar, for she never set foot outside the castle. Since her father, the king, and her mother, the queen, had died, she no longer dared venture outside. She thought the meadows and lakes were too dangerous, the forests too impenetrable. An old fairy tale which her subjects had long ago ceased to believe told of a monster lying in wait somewhere, hidden deep in a cave. The princess feared the monster. 2. The Secret Library. The next morning I woke with a start from a nightmare in which I'd been pursued by photos and laughter. The pictures had shown me in the swimming pool locker room without my bikini top, captured on the camera phone of so-called friend, posted on the year's Facebook page. This is your before picture on Extreme Makeover, Paul had commented on one of the photos, as if I needed a whole load of plastic surgery in front of rolling TV cameras just to be able to lead a normal life. In the dream, I'd shut myself in the school bathroom where no one could hear me and cried, just like in real life. Jolena really had taken the photos, and she really had shared them on Facebook, on WhatsApp, so that people with nothing better to do could look at me naked and laugh about it. It was stupid and childish, but it still hurt, especially because I thought Jolena and I were friends. But now it seemed she preferred to fit in with everyone else and keep hanging out with me. The geek, the bookworm, the nerd. Alexis had told me time and time again how wrong they all were, that it wasn't true what they said about me, that I was pretty and likable and a lovely person. I know it was mainly because they were jealous of my good grades and my fluent English, and that they were always looking for something that they could use to upset me, but part of me secretly believed them nonetheless, however stupid it was. There was a sore spot in my soul, a tiny hole through which my self-esteem was trickling away, but I wasn't going to let it. I promised myself. I was just going to forget about the photos and the laughter, and Stormsay was going to help me. Resolutely, I blinked back the images of the night and found myself lying in a four-poster bed. A swath of red-checked fabric was draped above my head, overflowing into four thick walls of curtain. My bed was like its own little room within a room, a cocoon with only me in it and the e-reader by my pillow, of course. It reminded me of when I was little, when I used to make caves out of old blankets and hole up inside them with my favorite books. I lay there a moment longer, gazing at the slivers of light that slipped through the clinks of the fabric here and there, painting patterns on the embroidered quilt. Then I got up. The guest room Mr. Stevens had put me in wasn't particularly big, but it was magnificently furnished, just like the rest of the house. The wallpaper was made of dark red silk with shiny floral pattern, and there was an armchair with gilded legs, a chest of drawers with a mirror mounted above it, and a deep window seat covered with cushions where you could sit and look out over the grounds and the moorland. My muddy suitcase stood in the middle of the room like a foreign object. I'd been much too tired yesterday to unpack it, and even now it was all I could do to fish out a few pieces of clothing. A pair of jeans, a shirt, and a long cardigan would have to do. My wardrobe wasn't particularly varied at the best of times. Unlike Alexis, I wasn't keen on brightly colored, patterned clothes and stripy tights. I preferred earthy colors, khaki or black. Directly opposite the four-poster bed was the door to my bedroom, which I was to share with Alexis. Environmentally friendly creams and pots of makeup, hair clips with flowers around the edges, and batik hairbands were already lined up along the edge of the sink and on the shelf above. Alexis had settled in then. She was probably already having breakfast. I was pretty hungry by now, too. After all, I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, apart from a couple of sandwiches at Dortmund Airport. I made a quick shower, threw on my clothes, and tied back my wet hair in a ponytail. Then I went out into the corridor in search of something to eat. I soon struck lucky. I'd only gone a few steps when the raised voices of Alexis and my grandmother showed me which way to go. Unfortunately, they seemed to be yelling at each other. At first I thought it was unintelligible shouting, but the closer I got, the more words I could distinguish. "I can't force her," cried Alexis. "Never have even come here if I'd known." "Did you think," replied my grandmother, "our family's birthright can't stop her from give a crap about her birthright? If you want to stay here, arg." I went up spiral staircase and onto another corridor. The voices grew clearer. She seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the hallway. "She likes reading, doesn't she?" asked Lady Merritt. "So why are you so against it? I'm sure she'll enjoy it. Have you forgotten what happened with me?" "No, of course not, but you ended up with the wrong book, that's all." "Still, it was horrible. I don't want that for Amy. She doesn't need those books." By this time I was outside the door of the room where the voices were coming from, and I pushed it open. I found Alexis and Lady Merritt seated in a sort of conservatory. Between them was a table laden with toast, sausages, eggs, bacon, and jam. I also spotted a stack of pancakes. My stomach rumbled audibly, but first I had to find out what Alexis and my grandmother were arguing about. "What's going on? What books don't I need?" I asked. Alexis gave a start and almost dropped the piece of dry toast she'd been nibbling on. Lady Merritt smiled. "Good morning, Amy. How was your first night at Lennox House?" "Good," I said. I like my canopy bed." "I'm glad. Would you like some breakfast?" My grandmother motioned toward an empty chair. "We can't offer you a German-style breakfast, I'm afraid. We have ordered supplies from Lerwick, but they won't be here until tomorrow." "How about some toast in the meantime?" "Thanks," I said, hoping myself to some sausages and bacon. I'm not a vegan. Alexis didn't particularly like it when I ate meat, but she knew my body needed more calories than hers because mine seemed to burn them the instant I swallowed them. That was why I lived my life by a simple motto: never pass up an opportunity to eat anything greasy. But at that moment Alexis didn't seem much to care that I was eating anyway. She was still glaring at my grandmother. Her jaw tightened. Lady Merritt, on the other hand, looking on approvingly as I shoveled the food into my mouth. "Your mother hasn't told you this, but we have a very special library here on Stormsay. It's very large and it's very secret," she began at last. "Some of the texts are over 2,000 years old, and I came from a famous library of Alexandria. Our ancestors rescued them from the fire there before building the library on Stormsay. Might you like to see it? Some of the volumes are priceless." I looked inquiringly at Alexis, but she was too busy casting her withering looks at her mother to notice. She didn't reply anyway. And I couldn't see what was so wrong with having a little non-committal look around a library, especially when it belonged to your own family. Yeah, I mumbled between mouthfuls, "definitely." "Excellent," said Lady Mara, and nodded. "In that case, Mr. Stevens will take you straight there." "Okay," I held myself to another pancake as Alexis almost burst a blood vessel. "Fine," she cried. "She can try it, but only one condition." Lady Mara had raised her eyebrows. "And what would that be?" Alexis gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. "That you give her a children's book," she declared. "Something completely harmless, a story where absolutely nothing can happen to her. I mean it. Give her a children's book, or we leave here right now." "Oh, good Lord," muttered my grandmother. And to be honest, I was thinking the same thing. Good Lord. The crazy gene of the Lennoxes strikes again. This time Alexis seemed to be the one feeling its effects. The library in question was not located at Lennox House, or in a house at all, in fact. When Mr. Stevens, who, to judge by the glossiness of his hair, had applied an extra helping of pomade today as a precaution against further assaults by clumsy house guests, had led me out into the moor, I thought at first that he was taking me to the castle on the other side of the island, which my grandmother had told me was home to a family named McAllister, but in the end she'd stopped at the bottom of a sort of hill. At the top of the hill were a number of enormous stone slabs piled one on top of the other. They formed a circle made of several gateways similar to Stonehenge, and their porous gray bodies were covered with moss and lichens. Mr. Stevens pointed not to the ancient monument, however, but to the mouth of the cave at the foot of the hall. "Here it is," he said, lifting a flaming torch from the bracket set into the rocket. "We are now entering the secret library, ma'am," he declared solemnly. "Okay," I said skeptically, but Mr. Stevens' stern face brooked no dissent. Plus, I liked being addressed as ma'am. At first the stone passageway led uphill for a few yards, but it ended abruptly at the center of the hill and gave way to a flight of steps carved into the rock, leading deeper and deeper underground. I ran my fingertips along the rough walls as I followed Mr. Stevens into the darkness. The steps were steep, and there were lots of them. We went down and down, step by step, for what felt like an eternity. The library was not inside the hill where the stone circle was, as I'd assumed. It was underneath it. Deep, deep underground. We must have been right down inside the bowels of the island by now, maybe even below sea level. From far away I thought I could hear the booming of the waves, whose idea had been to build a library in a place like this. The flight of steps ended as suddenly as it had begun, and I was met with a smell of old paper. This was where the bookshelves began. They were made of dark wood and were around 10 feet tall. There were narrow ladders at the regular intervals that could be slid from side to side. The shelves groaned under the weight of the folios and the leather-bound books, and in among them I could also make out paperbacks and yellowed scrolls. Aisles branched off everywhere from rows of shelves. Lady Mara had been right. This library was both enormous and ancient. It was full of whispered words, the lure of stories waiting to be read, a rustle of a promise that hung in the air. How many adventures were hidden here in the paper and ink? How many great love stories, how many epic battles. I'd fallen in love with the place already. I would have liked to just stand there, stoking the books, maybe taking one of them in my hands and leafing through it, perusing the deeds of some tragic hero. My steps began to slow, but Mr. Stevens led me inexorably on toward into the heart of the library with its labyrinth of aisles. Despite the many lamps that glowed between the shelves, it was too dark to make out the full extent of the cave system, and the aisles became more and more tightly interwoven the farther we went, but at last the walls of the books opened out into a space that looked a bit like a classroom. A rather old-fashioned classroom, to be sure, containing worm-eaten wooden desks with lids you could lift up to store books in the compartment beneath. But yes, it was definitely a classroom, and what worried me most of all was that it wasn't empty. In the front of the row sat a boy and a girl of my own age, and at the blackboard stood a bald man in a monk's habit. An invisible fist gripped my stomach and squeezed hard. I had to force my feet to keep walking. "Good morning, Glen. I have brought you Amy Lennox. The lady would like her granddaughter to attend lessons. Have you been informed?" asked Mr. Stevens as the man at the board nodded. "Ah, yes, thank you. We've been waiting for you." Lessons? The word set off alarm bells in my head. So this really was a school, and I was the new girl. And in the summer holidays, too. Fantastic. There was a bitter taste in my mouth. Stormsay was supposed to help take my mind off school, not. The girl in the front row had blonde hair just like Jolina's. I swallowed hard. The teacher beckoned me over to him. His eyebrows were so bushy it was almost as if they were trying to compensate for the lack of hair on his head. On his forehead was a jagged mesh of raised scars that stretched across his bald pate like a spider's web. He wore a patch over his left eye. He pretended not to see the dismayed expression on my face and shook my hand. "My name is Glen, and I've been teaching members of the Lennox and McAllister families for many years. It's good to have a Lennox among us once more." He gestured toward his two students. "These are Betsy and William McAllister, the laird's daughter and nephew. This is Amy Lennox, the lady's granddaughter." "Hi," I mumbled. "Hello." The girl was wearing a satin headband in her perfectly shiny blonde hair. Her eyelashes were long and thick with black mascara. She looked me up and down. The boy, however, merely nodded and smiled briefly, and went on writing in his exercise book. He had dark hair that stuck out in all directions as if he'd spent night outdoors in the thick of the storm, leaving them both to underline something in a Shakespeare sonnet. Glen and I withdrew to one of the bookshelves in the far corner of the classroom. At last I was able to get a closer look at some of the books. My gaze ran along the leather spines embossed with gold lettering. There was Alice in Wonderland, alongside Ronia, the Robber's Daughter, The Wizard of Oz, The Never-Ending Story, and a red leather-bound book, which turned out to be the Jungle Book. "Your two clans have been reading books since time immemorial, but they read in a different way from other people," Glen began. "And your families, ever since ancient times, a special gift has been passed down from generation to generation. That is why they share this library." "Uh-huh," I said, and Glen sighed. "Yes, I know you have no idea what I'm talking about. The lady tells me your mother kept all of this a secret from you, so it's probably best that I show you what I mean, and I shall do so directly, but first there is one thing you should know. The McAllisters and Lennoxes have not always lived so peacefully together on this land. Once upon a time they were locked in a bloody feud that lasted from the Middle Ages until about 300 years ago, when the hostility reached its peak. Their strife led to a fire, and one of the things destroyed in that fire was a particularly valuable manuscript. It was the only written record of a legend that is now lost forever. Ever since then, the families have observed a truce and devoted themselves to protecting literature and preserving the books you see here. That is why we built the library so deep underground, and why we tell nobody of its existence unless they belong to one of the two families, or have earned their trust. Everything we do and everything you will do, from now on, must be done for the good of the world of stories. You must make that promise before we begin, because the red leather binding on the Jungle Book shone out at me enticingly. "Read me!" it cried. "Read me, Amy!" My hand was drifting toward the books. At the last moment, I managed to stop myself from reaching out and grabbing one. I withdrew my arm abruptly, pretending I needed to scratch my cheek, and shifted my weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. As I did so, however, I managed to bump into one of the ladders propped up against the shelves, and it toppled over and fell to the ground with a deafening crash. My face turned red, and a derisive snort could be heard from the direction of the desks. Glen's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile, but a moment later he met my eye with the same stern friendliness as before. He cleared his throat and continued as if nothing had happened. "Well, Amy, yes? Do you vow that whatever you read you will strive to protect stories and to do nothing that might destroy or alter them?" Of course," I said. How on earth was someone supposed to destroy a story just by reading it anyway? Half an hour later, Glen, Betsy, William, and I entered the stone circle at the top of the hill. The Jungle Book lay red, smooth, and heavy in my hands. Naturally, I'd slipped on the wet grass climbing the hill, but I'd just about managed to keep the book from falling into the mud. The knees of my jeans, on the other hand, now sported a pair of greenish-brown stains, and I felt clumsier still in comparison to Betsy, who was trotting elegantly up the hill, and William, who tagged along at the back of our little group as if he were just out for a casual stroll. I wondered why exactly we had come out here to read, when the wind had turned so cold again. Bessie and William were carrying books under their arms, too, and Glen had brought along a mouldy-looking woven beech mat that he spread out in the mud beneath one of the gateways in the stone circle. "Will, would you go first?" he asked. "Sure," said the boy. His voice was deeper than I had expected, and his eyes were the color of the sky above us, stormy blue. He was also tall and thin, like me, but his body looked muscular, as if he were strong despite his skinniness. He strode purposefully over to the mat and lay down on it so that his head was positioned directly beneath the stone arch. Then he opened his book and laid it over his face. On the cover I could see a picture of an enormous dog. "The Hound of the Baskervilles" was the title. It was a Sherlock Holmes novel. I knew the story. I'd been given it for Christmas 4 years ago, but the dog on the front of my book wasn't quite as scary as this one. As I looked at the cover, the book suddenly dropped through the air and landed on the mat. The pages glowed for a moment. I blinked. No, it couldn't be. I blinked again, unable to grasp what I was seeing, but it was true. Will had vanished. Only the book remained in the stone circle. What? I exclaimed. These stones are from the Porta Literae, Glenn explained. They are the entrance to the world of stories. But I still couldn't get my head around the fact that Will seemed to have disappeared into thin air from one moment to the next. He's inside his book now, said Betsy with a condescending smile. No need to panic. It's totally normal for us. I opened my mouth and then shut it again because I didn't know how to reply. Glenn placed a hand on my arm. I know it is hard to believe, but this is the special gift possessed by your two families. Between your 5th and 25th birthdays, you have the ability to jump inside literature and check that everything is in order. Each of you takes special responsibility for one book in particular until the time you finish school. After that, you use your skills to protect the whole of the literary world. Betsy, for example, has been looking after this book of fairy tales since her 10th birthday. She is about to jump into Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Betsy swept her bangs out of her eyes. One of the dwarfs is causing trouble. He's taken it into his head to go off on his own and open an ice cream parlor. I've been trying for weeks to make him see sense. Snow White and the Six Dwarfs sounds just ridiculous. Was this a joke? Betsy settled herself serenely on the mat and opened her book. Well, here we go again, she said. Don't worry, Amy. You might not even be able to do it. No book jumper in history has ever left it till your age to start training. It's probably too late by now. Well, we'll see soon enough, won't we, Amy? Said Glenn, smiling at me encouragingly. Betsy shrugged and laid open the book of the fairy tales across her face. In a heartbeat, she too had disappeared. All that was left was the rustling of the pages as they landed on the mat. My mouth went dry. Book jumpers? I breathed. Did they really jump into the books? It sounded too absurd. It couldn't be true. Yes, said Glenn, and now it's your turn. Simply open the book at the page where you want to jump in and do as the others did. I don't know, I said. Was this some kind of stupid prank? An initiation ritual? Were Will and Betsy actually lying in the bushes with their camera phones waiting to film me making a fool of myself? Glenn interpreted my hesitation indifferently. You can do it, I'm certain of it. I think Betsy is mistaken. After all, you are a Lennox, and you can come back straight away if you're frightened. All you need to do is return to the page you jumped in at. But how, and for how long? And what should I stammered helplessly. This was crazy. People couldn't just vanish from one moment to the next and reappear as a book character. I can't explain it either, Amy, sighed Glenn as I remained rooted to the spot. But your families have been doing it for centuries. It just works, somehow. And nobody has ever failed to come back before, he added with a smile. You really have no need to be afraid. Your mother has even made sure that you first jump into a story which was absolutely safe. Give it a try, and have a little look around, and come back to the point where you started once you've had enough. Then we will see what you think of it. I looked first at the mat under the arch and then back at Glenn, scanning his good eye for evidence that he was lying, but I found none. Was he really serious about this whole thing? Did the members of my family really have a special gift? Did I have it too, the ability to jump inside literature? The idea was ridiculous and at the same time tantalizing. Until now, I'd only ever visited the world of stories, that world that held such fascination for me in my imagination. But if there was a way to entering it for real, I ran my fingers over the soft red leather in my hands and the delicate depressions formed by the imprint of the title, The Jungle Book. I'd never been in the jungle before, especially not one that was the home to Baloo the bear. A smile stole across my face. Glenn nodded. Just give it a try. He pointed to the mat. I lay down on it, as I'd seen the others do, with my head directly below the stone arch. I could hardly believe that I was actually doing this. It was utterly insane, and I caught myself giggling nervously, but I opened the book and laid it across my face. The paper slid smoothly over my cheeks and along the bridge of my nose until it covered my eyes. The letters were far too close up to read, swam before my eyes, melting into an inky whirlpool. They swirled around one another. They changed shape. Words flexed and twisted apart to form bushes and foliage, and then came pattering down like raindrops, a shower of words raining down on me. In the space of a heartbeat, I found myself lying among the roots of a gigantic jungle tree. Around me was an explosion of greens in every shade imaginable. Vines snaked around tree trunks, and ferns sprouted between them. The air was warm and humid and filled with the sweet fragrance of exotic flowers. Somewhere close by, I heard a child laughing. I sat up, flicked an oversized ant off my knee, and began to creep through the bushes in the directions of the voices. The vegetation was thick, but I had only gone a few yards when through the curtain of ferns I spied a group of wolves. The group consisted of 2 adult wolves with silver-gray fur, talking quietly to each other, and a whole heap of cubs at their feet, frolicking happily, with a naked human child who couldn't have been older than 2. Mowgli. This was the beginning of the Jungle Book. The wolf family had just found Mowgli alone in the jungle and decided to bring him up as one of their own, and I was right in the middle of it. I felt dizzy. I'd never read the book, but I knew the Disney version of the story. It had been one of my favorite films as a child. Was Bagheera the panther about to show up? Or Baloo the bear? Would he sing a song like in the film? Would he take me to the monkey's lost city? Would I be able to understand the language of the animals and speak to them? Oh man, I had really and truly jumped into a book. My thoughts tripped over one another as I crawled closer and closer to Mowgli and the wolf family. Unlike the Disney Mowgli, this Mowgli had curly hair, was not wearing red trunks. But just as I was about to burst from the undergrowth and meet the wolves of the family, "Hi, how's it going?" I suddenly felt something settle upon my back. I froze. Something was soft and warm and heavy, and felt suspiciously like the paw of some kind. Slowly, very slowly, I turned around and found myself face to face with a predator. It was Shere Khan, the tiger. His yellow cat's eyes blazed, and all of a sudden I remembered that the main storyline in the Jungle Book was about this very tiger trying to hunt Mowgli down and eat him because he was afraid of men and their guns, and because he was a tiger and the wild tigers have a tendency to eat humans. Shere Khan bared his teeth. The stink of his breath hit me square in the face. Now I understood why Alexis had insisted on me jumping into a harmless children's book. Unfortunately, however, even those didn't seem to be entirely risk-free. If I called for help, would the wolves be able to save me? I drew a deep breath, but before I could make a sound, the tiger put a claw to his lips. Put a claw to his lips? "You must not interfere with the plot, reader," whispered Shere Khan. "If they see you, they will not keep the man's club. Then you will be lumbered with the brat, and our entire story will fall apart." I stared at the tiger. He could talk. I said. The tiger cocked his enormous head to one side. "Not so loud," he murmured. "I just told you, come with me." The big cat moved off, and after a moment's hesitation I followed him into the jungle thicket. What was the likelihood that Shere Khan was only luring me away from the tumbling wolf cub so he could devour me in peace somewhere else in the forest? Was it even possible for me to die inside some story, or was a visitor from the outside world? Was I invincible? Powerful hands of muscle rippled beneath the tiger's striped coat as he prowled noiselessly onward. I, on the other hand, kept treading on snapping branches and rustling leaves, a far cry from the graceful elegance of my companion. If he really was planning to attack me, I didn't stand a chance, but with every step I took, my fear dissipated a little beneath the jungle canopy. I was reassured by the thought that Shere Khan could have killed me by now if he'd wanted to, but he hadn't, and somehow I couldn't imagine being eaten by someone I'd just had a conversation with a few minutes earlier. The tiger led me to a clearing where there was a fallen tree lying on the ground, and I sat down on it. Shere Khan lay down beside me, head on his paws. His tail whisked to and fro among the ferns. "I'm Shere Khan," he said. "Amy," I replied. "I'm sorry, I've never been in a book before, and I didn't know." "It's all right," returned the tiger. "I would say it's the law of the jungle, but it's the same everywhere in the book world. Readers are not allowed to intervene. Under no circumstances. You must always stay in the margins between the lines. Kind of like in the subplot?" Shere Khan nodded. "Okay," I said, and a fresh wave of excitement washed over me now that I was fairly sure the tiger wasn't going to hurt me. "What should I do, then? I'm very pleased to meet you, by the way. Do you know where I might find Baloo and Bagheera? Which way's the Monkey City? Are you really so terrified of fire?" The tiger sighed and stood up. "You had better ask someone in the outside world. In a few pages they are going to take Mowgli to the Pack Council, and then I will have to sit in the thicket and demand that they hand him over to me," he explained. "This is the way back to the plot and to the tree that will take you home again." Even as he spoke the last few words, he had disappeared into the tangle of the undergrowth. I stayed seated on my tree trunk for a moment. Should I go after Shere Khan and return to Stormsay, or... As if of their own accord, my feet carried me off in the opposite direction. This trip was far too exciting to turn back now. I'd spoken to Shere Khan the tiger. The whole thing was unbelievable, unbelievably awesome. Perhaps one of these days I really would have Momo's tortoise Cassiopeia as my guide, I thought, as I made my way deeper and deeper into the jungle. There were so many stories I would have liked to jump into, and so many characters I was desperate to meet, but coming face to face with a dancing Baloo in the Monkey City would do for starters. There were no footpaths in the jungle, of course, so I clambered over tree roots and boulders and battled my way through ferns and vines until the vegetation gradually began to thin out. But the trees gave way not to a lost city or an indigenous village as I had expected, but to a different landscape altogether. All at once the air was drier and cooler. A sandy road wound its way through the fields and meadows. In the distance I could see a windmill and a knight galloping toward it, lance lowered. Before me lay a crossroads with a towering signpost at its center. The Jungle Book was written in ornate, squiggly letters on the arrow, pointing in the direction I'd just come from. Another pointed to Shakespeare's tragedies. Other roads branched off into Don Quixote, Alice in Wonderland, and the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Wow, it looked as though I'd reached the edge of the Jungle Book, and could now decide which story I wanted to travel to next. I just resolved to pay a visit to the murderer with a split personality, Dr. Jekyll/Mr. Hyde, when I'd spotted another arrow It was smaller than the rest, and somebody had written a single word on it in a spidery hand as if it had been painted on in a great hurry. Margin. I never heard the title before, seriously. Since when had there been a book called Margin? The sign pointed to what could scarcely be called a road. It was more of a dirt track, flanked by craggy rocks. It was littered with rubble, but I had just successfully navigated a jungle thicket after all, and I was also exceedingly curious. Without further ado, I set off along the track, the strange title going round and round in my head. I made surprisingly good progress. Normally, I should have been bound to stub my toe, or fall over, or trip on a loose stone, but this literary rubble seemed to be on my side. The rocks on either side of me loomed higher and higher until they formed a ravine which I was now walking along the bottom of. The sand crunched under my feet and my footsteps echoed off the walls. After a while I thought I heard voices in the distance. Was I getting close to the next story? How long had I been walking? Was it only 5 minutes ago that I had been talking to Shere Khan, or an hour? Eventually I reached a bend in the path. As I turned the corner I saw a man sitting on the ground, though it took me a while to establish that he was a man because he was wearing silk stockings and heeled shoes and had his hair tied back in a ponytail with a velvet ribbon. He'd buried his face in his hands and flung his arms over his head in an attempt to protect himself from 3 old women who were flying through the air around him, hooded cloaks flapping. They were scratching at his arms with their long fingernails. "Hail to thee, young weather!" screeched one. "Thou shalt find happiness with Lot," called the second. "Thou shalt wed her by and by," shrieked the third. The man curled up into even tighter ball as his shoulders quaked beneath his embroidered waistcoat. A sob could be heard amid the jeers of the old women flitting around Werther's head. "Go away," he pleaded, a choke in his voice. But this had no effect whatsoever on his tormentors. "Hail to thee!" repeated the first, flying closer to the man. Her voice rang out across the ravine and made the crags tremble. Here and there showers of dust and stones cascaded down the rock face. Her victim made himself even smaller and not even attempting to fight back. "Hail to the young bride," began the first. I was so fixated on the scene that I forgot to look where I was going. I caught my foot on one of the larger rocks. I almost fell headlong into the midst of the whimpering man and his tormentors, but managed to steady myself just in time. The old women immediately fell silent and turned their watery eyes upon me. Their hair snaked out from beneath their ragged cloaks as if it had a life of its own. I cleared my throat, gurgled something that sounded vaguely like hello, and swallowed hard. The 3 old women hissed menacingly, and the man sobbed. Now that their attention was turned to me, I felt somehow obliged to try to help the poor wretch at the roadside. "Can't you see he's upset? Just leave him alone," the old woman grinned. "Thou art brave," rasped the second. "Thou art a reader," snarled the first. "Yes," I said, squaring my shoulders, "and who are you?" They laughed. "Thou wouldn't know who we are," scratched the third. "Come, sisters, 'tis time for our potion." They were still laughing as they spiraled up into the air and flew away. The man squinted out from between his elbows. "Thank you," he mumbled. "You're welcome. I hope I haven't messed up the plot," he said, remembering that I had only recently been warned by a massive tiger not to interfere with the progress of any stories. I bit my lip. But the man waved aside my anxieties. No, this is no man's land. I was on my way to the margin when you found me. To all intents and purposes they are harmless outside of their own play, but they take pleasure, you see, in reminding me of my sorrows. Why? Oh, because I am easy prey, I suppose." The man clambered effortfully to his feet, brushed the dust from his silk stockings, and pulled out an embroidered handkerchief. He blew his nose and gazed at me from under his long lashes. "Forgive me, but would you happen to be Miss Amy? Or, yes, how did you know my name? Half the fairy tale forest is looking for you, truth to be told. They say your friends in the outside world are afraid you might not have survived your jumper." Oh, I tucked my hair behind my ears. "I'd better set them straight, then." Soon afterward, when I jumped back to Stormsafe from the giant jungle tree and landed in the stone circle, the first thing I saw was the anxious faces of Betsy and Glenn. Will stood apart from the others on the brow of the hill. He was strikingly pale, and his hands gripped the hound of the Baskervilles so tightly that the veins showed blue under his skin. He was staring off into the distance and wouldn't even seem to register my arrival, but the other 2 came rushing over to me straight away. "At last," Glenn exclaimed. "Did you get stuck? Are you hurt?" His eyes examined me from head to toe. No, It's too late, simple as that," Betsy broke in. "She's too old to start training. A McAllister might be able to do it, but a Lennox—" "Betsy," admonished Glenn, but Betsy was undeterred. "It doesn't do anyone any good to have her stuck at her jumping point for hours, not even able to move. How is she ever going to learn how to speak to the characters? She should just stay here until the holidays are over and then go back to Germany. You can't force these things." Actually, I didn't get stuck," I said, picking my book off the mat. First of all, I talked to Shere Khan the tiger, then he had to go back to the plot, so I went on by myself, and eventually I got to the end of the jungle and I found a signpost, and you left the Jungle Book? Cried Glenn. Students aren't allowed to do that. Betsy wrinkled her nose. In her eyes was a flicker of something I'd seen before on the faces of my classmates in Germany, jealousy, but she did her best to hide it. Glenn folded his arms. Well, you do seem to be very talented, but I have to agree with Betsy in this instance. It's still far too soon and far too dangerous for you to explore the book world outside your practice books. Betsy nodded vigorously, and now at last Will did look over at us and eyed me with interest. The monster crept out of its cave, softly, softly. Nobody noticed it. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening. I'll read more maybe tomorrow. I don't know when exactly, but I'll read more of this soon. I just have more reading with my camera to catch up on, so I have to go. Goodbye for now.